So now we're up to the quarterfinals, and here's where I get to tell the rest of the story about why I felt so bad for Barry Pickens after the end of the tournament. Now I have to back up a little bit to tell this story to what happened on the morning of Elim Day. The National Debate Tournament was held that year in Oxford, Ohio. It was hosted by Miami of Ohio, and for all the prelim days, we had been heading out to the campus, and this is far enough back that there wasn't really an internet yet, so when you did your daily updates, you didn't do your updates by going to news sites. Instead, you had to get the actual physical copy of the newspaper, and that whole week, when I was there as their research assistant, I didn't pull out my laptop. That year, I had never seen a laptop. Instead, I would have to run off to the library, and I got pretty familiar with the Miami University Library and where everything was kept. But on Elim Day, they held all the Elim rounds in the hotel, and this hotel was out in the middle of nowhere. It was actually, the end of the name of the hotel was Lodge, and it was fairly rural. There was nothing around it. There were no convenience stores, nothing. And I think it was Danny who, on one of the previous days of the tournament, he had looked around and put two and two together, and he said, we need to think about how we're going to get a paper for Elim Day if Elim rounds are going to be held here, because we're not going to be able to get a paper here because there's no place to get one. So we kept our eyes peeled, and in downtown Oxford, there were a couple of convenience store type places that had racks out front where Elim Day was on Sunday, because I remember it was a Sunday New York Times that I got most of my stuff out of, and it was very thick. We found one that for some reason Danny said, there, that's the one. And so Sunday morning I got up a little early and they gave me the keys to the rental car, and I drove out to that place, and sure enough, they had the Sunday New York Times and they only had one left. So I picked it up and I went back to the hotel and I started combing through it for updates, only to find out that a lot of people associated with other teams that had cleared in the tournament had not thought about this and now didn't know where to go. They had picked up their daily updates at places around campus, and either they were unwilling or in some cases unable. They had taken the tournament shuttle and they couldn't get out to the campus, or it could have even been the case, thinking back after a lot of years, that those places around the campus were closed. They didn't open up very early because, what college students get up that early in the morning and want to read the paper? Maybe a handful, but not enough to really make business viable at that hour of the day, so they didn't open until mid-morning. And here I was with a Sunday New York Times. And I remember there were a couple of people who got fairly upset with me and made a couple of cracks at my expense, because they would come over and they would say, when you're done with that, could we have what's left? And I would look at them and I would say, I'll be done with this tomorrow morning. Because, I needed to hold on to that paper in case someone busted something new in the middle of the day. One of the first things we would do is we would go back to the paper and see if there was anything in it. It could be that someone would bust a new economics argument. We would need to dig out the business section. So I would tell them, no, I'm sorry, you can't have that. And the people who kind of picked on me for that, my answer was, well, this activity's got a big research component to it. And if I've tracked down a source that none of you found, if all the Baylor people got in our cars and did a road trip to a specialized library and we put together an affirmative, all of you would recognize that we had done extra work and we should enjoy the benefits of our labor. So if I'm one of the few people who found an up-to-date newspaper to have updates, well, the fact that I don't hand them over to you, that doesn't make me not a nice person in debate world. So I had to tell that story right now before the quarterfinals. It didn't make that huge a difference in the octafinals. There was one place that was a little bit funny, because Georgetown tried to answer the Frontline Wars part of the case by talking about a regional peace plan that had just gone into effect. Well, we had evidence from that morning's New York Times that there had been incidents the previous day. Some small groups of soldiers had driven through a lot of fairly large towns in the region and shot them up. And commentators that morning were saying that the peace plan looked like it was going to fall apart. And so Danny read that evidence in the 2AC to answer the regional peace plan takeout to the Frontline Wars part of the affirmative. And then in the 1R, Kevin Kuzwa said, my evidence postdates theirs. And Marty, in the first affirmative rebuttal, said, dirty word, dirty word, dirty word. Ours is from today. That's the only place where it came up in the octafinals. In the quarterfinals, all right, Danny and Marty are affirmative. They ran Cameroonian navies in the octos. They got burned for the second time, and they just decided, we're not running that thing again. Well, they had one other affirmative they brought with them, and you hear about that when you hear about the semis, but they wanted to sit on that because they looked at who else was still in the tournament, and they knew that the odds were very good they were going to need at least one more really good new affirmative. So when they debated Kansas, they just ran their old affirmative. They ran the affirmative that they've been running all spring. And Kansas, as it turns out, did not have a very tight, coherent strategy against it. They just ran 3 generics. And for the life of me, I've been racking my brain, and I cannot remember what the first one was. I remember that it was not terribly good. Well, I'm going to get ahead of myself if I say too much. So they've got 3 generics, and one of the reasons that New York Times stands out in my mind is that I had evidence from that morning's paper I'd supplied them with that pretty much punctured all 3 of them. Because it was that generic I can no longer remember, and there was something in the paper that made problems for it. And then the second argument was a politics disadvantage. And I already said in one of the previous videos, this was the moment in history when a lot of good internal link evidence was showing up in political science journals that made these arguments very viable. And I had evidence from that morning about things that had broken up bipartisanship. And so Danny was able to read New York Times Today to create problems for Kansas, winning uniqueness for this argument. And then, my very favorite, their third disadvantage I will never forget, because it was one that we had run a fair amount that year, the short-range ballistic missiles disadvantage. A lot of sort of mid-range military powers in Africa back in that period of time were working on developing short-range ballistic missile capability, and there was very good evidence that said that the check on it was the state of their economies. And there were a lot of very popular affirmatives that gave foreign aid, that helped them, took care of particular problems that caused widespread disease, widespread famine, and you could easily find initial link evidence that helping these nations handle these problems would improve their economy. So we had that as a pretty broad topic generic. Anything that was going to help any of these mid-range powers grow, we would run the short-range ballistic missiles disadvantage on, and that was going to cause regional arms races and brush fire wars, and this is before the fall of the Soviet Union, so back then you could win that a little regional war could draw in the superpowers because they were the superpowers' proxies in the region. So, Baylor's affirmative in that round, I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the amendment, but Egypt was in very bad shape economically, and they had gone... It was by the 1st of May, they were going to have gone 12 months without having paid anything on their debt. And there was an amendment in United States foreign aid law that said if you went 12 months without any debt service at all, then all U.S. foreign aid was cut off. And what Concordia University had done from the beginning of the year, they'd won a lot of debates just by giving Egypt an exception. Well, a lot of people have put their strategy together why that was really a bad idea, and Concordia wasn't winning as much in the second half of the year, but Danny had found solvency evidence and an advocate for the idea that you should just let Egypt take its FMS money, its military aid money, and treat that as fungible. Oh, no, that's what it was. Concordia was letting them use block grants as cash grants, and what Danny was doing instead was letting them use military aid to pay off ESF obligations. So a lot of people's strategies for debating Concordia were entirely based on that plan mechanism. So when Baylor shows up with an Egypt affirmative and the plan mechanism is completely different and none of those strategies work, they actually racked up a fair number of wins with that. So here we are in the quarters of the NDT, and that's what Danny and Marty are running. And so there's the generic I can't remember. There's the bipartisanship disadvantage with deficit hawks being the link to that they're not going to like it, with Egypt being off the hook for making its debt service payments. And then the third disadvantage is short-range ballistic missiles. If you help Egypt's economic status, then Egypt will be able to develop short-range ballistic missiles. And here it comes. Because we had evidence from that morning's New York Times. I'm telling you, everything happened that weekend. That Egypt the previous day had successfully flight tested a short-range ballistic missile. And the article, the analysis portion of it, went on to say that Egypt now plainly had this capability, had fully developed it. Apparently the economy had not been a barrier to it. It was just taking a stake and just driving it through the heart of that argument. So Danny obviously reads that evidence, makes his other answers. I don't even remember what else their strategy was to answer that argument. But Barry Pickens gets up to give the 2NC. And he goes to that first generic I can no longer remember and just kicks out of it, concedes away some of the takeouts from the 2AC, it's gone. He then goes to the bipartisanship disadvantage And he starts to go through it. He's answering the 2AC. And what Danny had done, I do remember the strategy on this one, because Marty and Danny had done so much work to be ready for politics debates, Danny just impact turned it. Just a bunch of arguments why, the position in the 1NC, Kansas position, had been that the plan was unpopular and that was bad. And so Danny had 4 or 5 reasons that an unpopular plan was a good idea because it would stop the current administration's agenda. And I remember the first one that Barry got to was anti-satellite weapons, just like I was talking about in the Harvard debate back in the prelims. And he gets to that, and he blanks for a second, and he turns over to his partner Chuck Krause, and he says, "Would you grab me the ASATs file?" And then he says, "Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Let me go to short-range ballistic missiles." And he goes through the short-range ballistic missiles argument, answering the 2AC, reading a lot more evidence, ballooning the disadvantage. And, his answers to this evidence from this morning that Egypt now has the capability, and apparently the economy wasn't a constraint upon it, he's doing his best, and he's trying to draw distinctions that frankly don't exist. And it's fairly obvious that this is going to become what he hopes he can get Baylor to spend some time on, but he wants to win the politics disadvantage. So he gets to the bottom of it, and he turns to Chuck, and Chuck looks up at him and says, "We don't have that file." And he looks down, and he was silent for a good 10 or 15 seconds. And then, loudly, said a real foul word, and then kicked out of the politics disadvantage. And then Chuck and the 1NR, the only thing he did was go for some case arguments, and none of them were turns, none of them were offense, which meant the only thing Kansas had coming out of the block was the short-range ballistic missiles disadvantage, which had gone away that morning from that morning's paper, and then some takeouts on the case. And that decision, the judge's decision, was a 5-0, and it took about 10 minutes. All right, so that's the story. That's the University of Kansas tale of woe, and that sets us up for the semifinals. And the semifinals was a lot more of a near miss.